This is Sarah.
Hey, Sarah, do you remember Brian Fairchild?
Yeah, he was the CIA officer that worked in Eastern Europe, right?
Yeah, we did 2 episodes with him, one Green on Blue and another one on ISIS.
And he encouraged us to look into our intelligence community
And more specifically, our lack of human intel
and what it means to national security.
The timing's great, Joe, because I have a friend who led the Defense Intelligence Agency and just recently retired.
That was the biggest topic for him, about how we don't have enough human intelligence
Collectors on the ground and how we're kind of missing the boat on that.
Let's dig into this a little bit, and if it really is a threat to national security, let's try to find a way to explain that to our viewers.
Okay, I'll give him a call and I'll get back to you on it.
I'm tired of the politics on both sides.
I can't believe anything that they say.
We are not getting journalism. We are not serving
Washington
the public.
is
Washington works for anyone who can hire an army of lobbyists and lawyers.
The media bias, I guess, just depends on which channel you are. I think that we need a different point of view.
The media has gone over the top.
They can't stand the truth, and apparently the news media can't stand the truth either.
Congressmen and senators have lots of power, and we know that power corrupts.
Special checks and the winks and nods run Washington.
The Central Intelligence Agency was established under the National Security Act in 1947. It was to be the premier strategic intelligence organization for the United States. The agency is probably most famous for the Cold War spies of the 70s and 80s. Brian Fairchild was one of those spies. He worked overseas. When he first joined the CIA, he worked in non-official cover, or what's known as a knock.
My first assignment was a non-official cover assignment, which was a good thing because, as a young case officer starting out, I really learned tradecraft well. You're basically out in the cold. You don't come into the embassy. For all intents and purposes, you're not anything to do with the U.S. government.
Are there a lot of people like you around the world?
Yeah, there were a lot of case officers, and a lot of case officers, went through the system, and some retired and some left for other opportunities. But there are quite a few, still around. During my time, the majority of case officers spent all of their time recruiting sources. And when I say that we recruited sources, and this is, I'm not giving away any secrets here, we recruited spies. We tried to recruit people in the government, in opposition movements, and throughout the country, wherever we had a strategic need for information. And we were basically set up to counter the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviets were a global power. Wherever the Soviets were, we wanted to be. But that required us to understand the world. Because if the Soviets were going into Latin America, what countries were they going into? We had to understand those countries. Why were those countries, wanting to deal with the Soviet Union? We had to have a deep understanding of the world in a strategic sense. So our case officers spent their entire careers living overseas, working overseas, using foreign languages, understanding the cultures, understanding the local politics. But the agency's really changed.
Was there a tipping point, a specific time?
Yeah, the tipping point was 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union. That was a tipping point because the war had been won. The Cold War was won. We had won it. And so, what do we need a strategic intelligence agency for anymore?
We left people standing on street corners. There were human intelligence assets and folks that were cooperating with us to one degree or another who were just told, okay, see ya, or not even that. Their good friend Bob, the American, just never showed up again, never made his meetings, never. So we left people standing on street corners who had put their faith and trust in us.
Chris Farrell was a case officer for the Defense Intelligence Agency during the Cold War. He was based in Eastern Europe. My producers and I met with Farrell at his office in Washington, D.C., where he works as the Director of Investigations for Judicial Watch.
Operations against real, legitimate bad guys, bad countries doing bad stuff were put on hold. People would not even entertain these operational concepts that were being offered.
Many of the politicians and the political leadership said, you know, you guys did a great job. You won the Cold War. Now it's time to reap the peace dividend. You know, so all the money that was going into the agency was going somewhere else now.
The new world we have entered is far from being clearly definable, and it cannot be characterized as precisely and as succinctly as the one from which we are emerging, the Cold War against the Soviet Union.
The man in charge of the CIA at the time was James Woolsey. In multiple media appearances since he left the agency in 1995, Woolsey has been more than candid about the challenges he faced in budget cuts and a widespread lack of interest in intelligence gathering.
There was a fairly widespread feeling within the United States government, in the Clinton administration, in the White House, and even more intensely, I would say, in the Congress, that, hey, things are fine. We don't need to bother with this stuff anymore. I even had one of the men whom I have most admired in public life in modern American history, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, come to me and say, Jim, look, the Cold War's over. Do we really need a CIA?
So for the next 10 years, from 1991 to 2001, CIA was an organization in search of a mission.
A stunning and cowardly strike on the United States. Terrorists send mighty skyscrapers crumbling to the ground.
All of a sudden we found one. And September 11th, 2001, you know, the 9/11 attacks. All of a sudden, the agency found a new mission, and it was counterterrorism.
And when you fast forward 10 years, and you've done nothing to develop these sorts of operations or cases, no one should be surprised that there's no human intelligence there when 9/11 occurs. And we look around the world and say, okay, who can tell us about whatever? And there's no one there.
While the CIA's human intelligence network shrunk, the agency was less prepared to confront the rise of emerging global enemies.
George Tenet, who was the director at the time, said it was basically in Chapter 11 bankruptcy. You know, it had gotten that bad.
In his memoir, At the Center of the Storm, Tenet went on to write, neither Congress nor the executive branch did much about it. Their attitude was that we could surge ahead when necessary to deal with challenges like terrorism. The FBI had more special agents in New York City than CIA had clandestine officers covering the whole world.
You don't have the ability to develop the relationship with the source. You can't conduct training. You can't conduct operational tests of the source. Everything is more, better, faster, right? And when you're operating in a more, better, faster mode, you have greater mistakes that are made, higher level of potential compromise. You don't get to really verify who is this person and are they really working for you. There's a great New Yorker cartoon where this guy's sitting at a conference table and he looks up and says, get me everything on everybody now, right? That's not what an intelligence officer wants to hear, because it's impossible. You can't get me everything on everybody now. It doesn't work that way.
Because of that, we had to rely more and more on our relationships with foreign intelligence services. That's great if they give you the best intelligence, if they're not corrupt, but we didn't have much of a choice. So we became more and more dependent on foreign intelligence services.
This is a sentiment held by many former high-level CIA officials, including the man that led the agency's hunt for Osama bin Laden in the 1990s. In an April 2013 interview with For the Record, former CIA officer Michael Schur told us that the agency's reliance on foreign intelligence was a major obstacle in hunting down the world's most wanted man.
One of the main problems in dealing with al-Qaeda was Saudi Arabia. And they continually refused to assist us in any meaningful way in trying to understand more fully or even trying to apprehend Osama bin Laden. I'll give you an example. In February of 1996, we asked the Saudis for very basic information about Osama bin Laden. his birth certificate, his medical records, his financial records. When I resigned in November 2004, we still hadn't received that material.
I'm very sad to say this, but the American intelligence bureaucracy ranges from stupid to naive, and it's basically a scam.
Robert Steele had a prolific career in the CIA. Working mostly in Central and South America during the 1980s, he is considered an expert on human intelligence gathering. Steele is outspoken and, at times, controversial, even accused of embracing conspiracy theories. But, like Fairchild and Farrell, he worked in the field. His job was to develop sources. He says today the U.S. depends too much on other nations.
One of the reasons we failed in Afghanistan is because we took the bulk of our intelligence from Pakistan. And as your listeners might imagine, governments tend to lie to each other a lot.
So basically, the reports, the analysis that's coming from the ground, from the guys collecting the information, if we have any out there, the very few that we have, when it reaches CIA headquarters.
No, you're not
reviewed.
understanding. We don't
just
have
don't
guys
have
in the
it.
field. We don't have people across the Middle East. We don't have penetrations of ISIS, for example.
So we have chief of stations, but no real penetration.
We have chiefs of stations who are receiving information from foreign liaison and turning it in where it's being treated as clandestine collection. I mean, just to tell you how seriously flawed CIA is today, they're training CIA case officers now to go around with bodyguards. There is nothing more ridiculous in Afghanistan than seeing a case officer with 2 black SUVs surrounded by guys with ink.
So the agency has gone from this premier national strategic intelligence organization to a very narrowly focused paramilitary counterterrorism organization now, which I think is sad, because the agency was the only organization really created to be the nation's premier strategic intelligence organization. And without them performing that mission, there is nobody else who has that charter.
After meeting with Brian Fairchild, Chris Farrell, and Robert Steele, it was evident the erosion of human intelligence gathering that started in the 1990s has forced the United States to rely on intelligence from foreign services, paramilitary missions, and perhaps most dangerously, on massive electronic data gathering in the post-9/11 world, which has ignited a debate over privacy and national security.
Well, take NSA. NSA is collecting every email and every phone call and every internet screen view you've ever had. Now, the good news is they're not processing it. The bad news is if you ever become a senator, they will tell you they have everything you ever did.
So basically, what we're collecting isn't really doing any good in the world of fighting the insurgency?
Absolutely. It's worthless. When I was handling terrorists, we would do telephone intercepts, and because it was very sensitive terrorism-related stuff, I had to do the transcripts myself. And I will tell you, as a general rule of thumb, 90% of the value in telecommunications comes from who's talking to who, not on what they're saying. I mean, when I was in El Salvador, the insurgents knew what our capabilities were, and they were using couriers and newspaper advertisements to communicate. They were not revealing their plans and intentions to NSA.
You could have all the satellites in the world and all the technology in the world and all the intercept kind of capabilities, but at the end of the day, much like you and I are talking, in order for people to understand what we're talking about, they have to have someone in this room.
Fred Burton was a counterterrorism agent for the U.S. State Department from 1985 to 1999 and now serves as a vice president for Stratfor, a private sector intelligence firm.
That's the rub. Get that person in the room that is usually a trusted member of that staff to basically betray their country. And that becomes an extraordinarily difficult challenge.
Burton says since 9/11, the CIA has been laser-fixed on terrorism, and that has left intelligence gaps worldwide.
Now we have huge espionage problems. We have the Russians moving into Ukraine. We have Russian sleeper cells picked up in New York. And the FBI, too. The FBI has transformed their agency after 9/11 to become more intelligence-focused. So how do you balance what's more critical for our national security? Is it espionage or is it terrorism? And the pendulum has swung of late towards terrorism.
According to a January 2010 report from a prominent military leader, the intelligence community was not positioned to support the mission of fighting terrorism.
The report was written by General Michael Flynn in January 2010. And it was really an indictment of the intelligence community. And he wrote in his report, after 8 years of being here in Afghanistan, the efforts of the intelligence community are marginally relevant to the strategic understanding and the strategic winning of this campaign.
I recognize that we were overly focused on capturing and killing the enemies that we were facing there.
Lieutenant General Michael Flynn served as director of the Defense Intelligence Agency from July 2012 to August 2014. Prior to that, he served as Assistant Director of National Intelligence and had a decorated career in the U.S. Army.
Our forces were changing, our strategy had changed, but the intelligence system had not changed. And it frankly, it needed that sort of a, I would say nudge, others would say push, others would say shove, to start moving in the right direction to support this new strategy in Afghanistan.
Is there a canal system now?
All we knew was that there was this insurgent group and it had 25 guys in it, and they were in Logar, and they traveled around this way, and they had these kind of weapons, and if we can get their coordinates, we can bring drone strikes on them, and we can kill them.
So counterterrorism and the capabilities that we have for that are awesome. They're exceptional. And I equate that capability to the best spear fishermen in the world. They can focus precisely, hone in on, understand better than those that they're going after in many cases, and they can sort of get their guy, right? And they do it very well. We've seen it time and time again. The Bin Laden raid is used as an example. But that component, if that is all we use, then we are losing sight of what it is that we need to do on a sort of a bigger scale.
Combat troops will not be returning to Iraq.
That was 2010. Now it's 2015. Same problem. We're focused on insurgent groups, we're focused on drone strikes, we're focused on individuals, but we still don't understand who all those folks are. We don't understand why we have this problem called the foreign fighter problem.
And I think that as we proceed to today and we begin to look at the future, we have to deal with the underlying current of the ideology and frankly this disconnect in the Islamic religion between what these extremist viewpoints are and what we would like to see the moderate Islamist world be.
You can't solve the problem unless you define the enemy. You can't define the enemy unless you understand the enemy. And you can say all day that they're violent extremists and insurgents, but if you don't understand them, you can't solve the problem. And so that's the problem that we have today.
One of the recurring themes we were hearing was that the United States has become overly dependent on technology and foreign intelligence. Since the Edward Snowden case broke, the NSA has been embroiled in controversy over questionable collection techniques and charges of privacy violations throughout the world. In the debate over using foreign intelligence, the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, known as the ISI, has sponsored Taliban attacks on American targets. And most recently, multiple reports have tied prominent members of the Saudi royal family to funding al-Qaeda.
We've spoken to a number of people in the intelligence community, many who said we rely too much on technology, we rely way too much on foreign intelligence services. Do you agree?
I do. And I think that in the intelligence system, there's really three components. There's people, there's processes, and there's technology. And we tend to lean on the technology. If you've only lived in Washington, D.C. in the intelligence community, you need to get out into the field. You can't do everything sitting back in a cubicle somewhere. And I think that most intelligence professionals, particularly our young people in the intelligence community, those that have served overseas in the combat zones and in other countries around the world, they would absolutely agree with me.
Flynn said one of the biggest threats is the global shift in population, specifically in the areas that have become new targets for groups like the Taliban and ISIS.
We need people that understand the cultures and the societies from hands-on, what I'd like to describe as a fingertip feel for the operating environment.
The leader of France, your ally in this effort, has put a name on this ideology, which he calls radical Islam. You have bent over backwards, to not ever say that. There must be a reason.
I certainly wouldn't want to be in a position where I'm repeating the justification that they have cited that I think is completely illegitimate, right? That they have invoked Islam to try to justify their attacks.
Has political correctness affected our intelligence community?
What I've learned is, as an intelligence officer from the beginning of my career, I typically wasn't the guy that was going to bring in the good news in the morning, I mean, my responsibility was to define the threats that we were facing. The intelligence community has to be one of the most trusted institutions in this country. We have to be the ones that sort of are the truth sayers, if nothing else. Now, so I tell my boss, this is what the enemy is, this is who the enemy is, this is how I think the enemy is going to fight us. So if he decides to continue to fight his plan and not the enemy, that's a mistake. And I think that I've seen that quite a bit, actually, where you disregard the threats that you're facing and you stick to a plan, and the plan has no connection to the threats that we're facing. And for me, that's why I have been over my career outspoken on that count, because I just feel like we can't allow our intelligence system to have any sense of loss of trust between it and the American public.